Let's tackle part one of this lab, and that's building the bars, tone, and slate. I need to create some items for this part of the project, and they're not assets that I'm going to necessarily import into the session from outside, but they're things that I can generate from within Premiere. Some of those new items that I'm allowed to generate I can access by right-clicking in my project window and selecting New Item. Here I want HD bars and tone. If I click on HD bars and tone, a pop-up window appears, and this particular new item generator has analyzed a little bit of my timeline, and it understands my raster size and my frame rate and my pixel aspect ratio, and it's going to choose 48K 16-bit audio. Those are the parameters that I want, and so I'm going to click OK. HD bars and tone is a file that's generated by Premiere, and if I double click, it'll show me that the tone is 1000 Hz or 1 kHz at minus 12 dB, which is exactly what we want it to be. If we click OK, we can move the bars and tone into our Slate Elements bin so that it's where it belongs. And we can drag it onto our timeline, but according to that document that we looked at in part one, the different rules and step-by-step guide for the NTSC bars, tone, and slate, we want the bars and tone to start at exactly 10 seconds. And so we're going to look here at our timeline, and we're going to find exactly 10 seconds. I just clicked out onto the timeline, and I'm at 11 seconds and 14 frames. So I'm going to use my arrow keys just to back up to exactly 10 seconds. There we are. And with my snapping function turned on, the magnet, and my link selection turned on so that the tone and the bars always stay together, I'm going to drag the item out onto my timeline. And we can see it here in our program window. We have our color bars, we have our luminance values, and down below we have our 1K tone at minus 12 dB. The challenge here, the small problem, is that it comes in at just about 4 seconds, 5 seconds worth of content. It's a very short duration, and we need to extend that all the way out from 10 seconds to 40 seconds, meaning that we're going to have a full 30 seconds of bars and tone so that we can calibrate playback when our project is finished. So I'm going to find 40 seconds, and I clicked out just a little bit past, and I'll use my arrow keys again. I can hold the arrow key down, or I can tap it to move forward or backward in time. And I'll use the crop function of the selector tool with the link selection on, and I'll just extend the length of my bars and tone out to that full 30 seconds so that they end at exactly 40. I'm going to use my scroll function here and my zoom function a little bit, and they're down at the bottom of my timeline. Because now I want to create a base layer of video background for my slate and my countdown. And my slate and countdown take up space between 50 seconds and 58 seconds and 2 frames. And that 2 frames is kind of an important part of this countdown and slate, because we have something that will occur called a 2-pop. A 2-pop is an audible beep at exactly 58 seconds. It lasts only a few frames, thus 5802, and it alerts us that program will start in exactly 2 seconds. The 58th second after the 2-pop is blank and silent, the 59th second is blank and silent, and program starts at exactly the 1-minute mark in this case. We do this because there are times when we might want to start with just audio and our picture is black, or we want to start in silence and darkness to create some tension and fade in slowly. And so we want that 2-pop to let whoever is viewing this or broadcasting this or formatting it for another playback situation to know exactly where we're starting, regardless of what you're seeing and hearing. If we rely just on moving the playhead over to where we first see picture or we first hear sound, we might not be showing the beginning of the piece as intended. And so that's the real reason that we're going to have this countdown and 2-pop along with our slate. So I'm going to use a 3-point editing process now, where I'm going to go to 50 seconds exactly, and I'm going to mark an in with the I key on my timeline. And I'm going to set a second point at 58:02 using my arrow keys and the playhead, and I'm going to mark an out with the O. And when we talk about 3-point editing, which we briefly touched on in AVP 100, the idea is that we're using in and out points both in the preview window and in the program window or timeline to identify 3 key points for the edit: the in point, the out point, and where we either want the footage to begin visually or end visually, or begin aurally sound-wise or end sound-wise. So we've identified this region that we want to fill now, and I'm going to use my slate elements, and I'm just going to pick a background, one of these elements of time, TEL, and I'll select one of these 3 elements. And I kind of like these interesting gears, so I'm going to use those. You can use whatever it is that you prefer. One thing that you may notice, if you've got that keen eye developing already, is that in our source window, our footage looks a little bit more square, and in our program window, we have a more rectangular viewing space. That's because the gears are older footage, older stock footage that we have here on campus, and this is actually a smaller raster size and a different aspect ratio. So one thing that we'll have to do if we want to fill the screen is increase its scale or size. So I know that I have 10 seconds of this footage, and so I'm going to just mark an in point here on my source window with I, and then I can either drag out onto my timeline and crop, or I can hit the insert or overwrite key, and I'm going to overwrite into this space. So I'm going to jump back to my beginning, and I'm going to overwrite into the space with the period key. I just tapped that period key and I filled the space that I had identified as my 3-point edit with the footage, and it's the exact length at the exact place I want it to be. And I tend to edit a little bit more in 3-point editing styles simply because I can be a little bit more targeted and a little bit more stealth with what I'm doing. I don't mind the drag, drop, and crop method, but it does take a little bit longer to slip and slide things into place. I now have my background, but you can see the pillars on the sides, left and right. And one thing that we maybe haven't mentioned is that when I put a clip onto the timeline, each clip that I put onto the timeline comes with some built-in parameters that I'm able to change and tweak if needed. I can always add more functionality to each clip with filters and effects, but there are some things that come built in to every clip that we're allowed to just access and target and use, and one of them is scale and or position. And so I'm going to double-click on the item on my timeline, and it's going to reload into the source window in the upper left. By reloading the clip, I'm telling Premiere that I want only the piece that's on the timeline to be in my source window. I don't want that original master clip in there anymore, because I want to affect the piece that's on the timeline and leave the master clip alone. And I use the term effect because up in the source window now I have an effects controls tab in the header. And if I click effects controls, I can see a number of things that I have access to now with this one particular clip. Nothing else on the timeline will be affected, only the clip that I've replaced, reloaded into my source window. And under effects controls motion, if you don't see the parameters, there are these little tiny arrows pointing to the right, and we can open those functions. And we can see values. The scale is currently at 100%, but if I change that, let's say, to 130%, I've almost filled the frame. I can still see a little bit more space left and right. I could type again, or I can mouse over the value, and I get a left-right arrow, and I can click, hold, and drag left or right, and increase the size of the clip to fill the frame. Now we have to be careful here, because if I take a clip such as this, a standard definition clip, and I scale it up significantly, I will lose resolution. You don't lose resolution when you have a larger raster size and you scale down. You will lose resolution when you have a smaller raster size and you scale it up. So we have to be careful. Now, I'm taking the liberty here to do this simply because I know that this is a background for a slate, and the audience or the viewing public will never see this. It's not intended for them to view. I do have my background here, and now I'm ready to add either my countdown or my slate. And let's go ahead this time and start with the countdown. To create a universal count, we need to do the same process that we did for the bars and tone over in our project window, and that would be right-click, New Item, and here we want Universal Counting Leader. The term leader is a throwback term from film days. It was information, an additional film placed at the beginning, the head, and the end, the tail, of a reel of film to allow you to thread. So it was the leading frames, the leading film, prior to the actual movie itself that allowed us to thread. And so the name is a throwback. We will go ahead and select Universal Counting Leader, and you see that it has the same basic pop-up window with raster size, frame rate, pixel aspect, and the sample rate, and we can click OK. And we get a secondary pop-up window, and you could play around with this if you want. I'm going to leave mine alone, but you can change the colors, the backgrounds, the wipe color, the line colors, all of those things. But the important thing here is that we want to cue the blip on out, and we want to cue a blip on to. To is the most important. I'm going to turn blip on out off, but leave audio blip on to on. That's the to pop. It's going to generate that little sound file. And I'll click OK. My universal count and leader is here, and I can open that. Again, make any changes that I want. But what I'd like to do is place it into my source window, and currently I still have my gears. And if I double click like I normally would, I get the pop-up window to change the look and feel of my universal count. So here I need to actually drag my media item up into the window. And you notice that it's 11 seconds long. I'm circling here in the bottom right-hand corner, and that tells me the total length of the clip. What I want to do is find that little to, the blip. And so I place my playhead somewhere out towards the end, and there's the to. And so I'm going to back up to where that to is, and I'm going to mark an out point. Again, I'm using a 3-point method. And I'm going to do kind of a hybrid here. I have the out point set, and I want to now drag sound and picture. So I'll use the actual image itself. I'll click and drag and snap this item to the end of my timeline, where the Tel 010 media clip is, which is the background for my count and my slate. I'm just going to drag this out and place it at the end. And I should then see that as I'm roaming through the 3 count and I'm coming up on the 2 count, I'm a little off here. I'm 2 frames off. And so I need to zoom in, and I can tell that I'm 2 frames off because here is 58 in my time code, and I haven't yet hit the 2. And so my in and out points are just a little bit off. And what I want to do is slide back my 2 so that it lands at exactly that 58 mark. And then I'm going to extend those extra 2 frames out into the timeline. And while I'm here, I'm also going to trim the beginning so everything starts together. Now, if I would have been a little bit more targeted and specific with my out point here, I might not have had to go through that trim process, but I was just a few frames off. Not a mission critical deal, nothing to really worry about. We just have to make sure that the 2 generates at exactly the 58-second mark. And here we can see I'm still in the 3 count at 57:23 frames, and when I get to exactly 58, the 2 pop occurs, and we're out, and our program will start at 1 minute. Now, one thing that you notice is that by placing the universal count and leader out on the timeline, we've covered up our background, the gears that we wanted to have in place. And that's because we have a full raster countdown here, and it's fully opaque. We could resize this, we could change its opacity, and we could resize and reposition this to place it somewhere so that we can share the screen with our background and our countdown. And let's do that. And let's also keep in mind that the final step here is to create a title graphic that contains our Slate information. And so we're going to want to share the screen with all 3 elements: the text object, the countdown, and the background. And thinking that through, I'm going to place the countdown in the bottom right-hand corner out of the way, and that way I can have my background in view, and my Slate information can be in the upper left and share space with the count in the bottom right. I'm going to need to open up my universal counting leader in the effects controls. And so I'm going to open with universal counting leader highlighted. I'm going to open the effects controls, and I'm going to take my scale, and where we did increase before, this time I'm going to decrease. You can see I can make it much smaller. And now I could use the numbers for position X and Y, but there's a little secret here. If I can see the whole frame of the universal counting leader, and I click on the word motion, which contains my position and scale, I get something called a wireframe. And if you've used Photoshop or Illustrator in the past, a wireframe will be very familiar to you. I can click on the word motion, and I get little handles, a frame around the image that I've selected. And if I grab a corner, I can scale. And if I just grab from anywhere on the image, don't grab this target, this little bullseye. That's something we'll work on later on in one of our edit labs called anchor points. But I can just grab the image and I can place it wherever I want, top, bottom, left, right, resize it. I'm also, just because we're in this effects controls area, I'm going to look down in the area called opacity, just below motion, and I'm going to click on opacity and just bring the opacity down ever slightly, and that way I can see a little bit of the gears going on behind this countdown. Now these things will play simultaneously, and when we get to the 2-pop, we'll hear the beep. The final element that we want to generate now fills the same amount of space. We'll use video channel 3 because we're layering these 3 items together. And what we need to do is create a text object. And we do that with our title tool over here in our tools bar. Your toolbar may be completely vertical. I have 2 columns here. I say it's at the very bottom because if it is a one vertical row, I can click on that very bottom tool called the title tool. And when I activate the text tool and I mouse over to the program window, let's go here. You'll see that the cursor changes from the grab and place arrow to a small text box. And I can click in the upper left-hand corner and I can type. And the things, according to the instructions, are we start out with client, and I'm going to return, and then we have title, and then we have program length. I'm just going to use the word length. We do call it program length because we don't want to include this 1 minute of setup in the length indication on the slate. So if my project ends up being 45 seconds, the length is 45 seconds. It's not 1 minute and 45 seconds. We do not add the 1 minute of bars, tone, and slate into the length. Fourth, here we would have audio format. And that would be stereo or mono, or in the event that you're in surround sound. Some slates include sampling frequency and bit depth at times so that people know that this is a 48K 16-bit WAV file. Depending on the delivery and what your client requires, some of these things may change. And then finally, the date. And the date is important. That should be the date of export. If it's a rough cut, you might want to put in the title rough cut so that you know that this isn't a final version. It's just something to show progress. And then lastly, if we look down in our area on the timeline, that third layer didn't fill the entire length or space that my background and my counting leader did. And so I just want to use my trim tool, trim and expand, to expand out for the full duration of that 8 seconds and 2 frames from 50 to 58:02, so that now everything will play simultaneously. I will see all 3 elements working together. And eventually, I'll go back into that title and I'll add the client name, the title of the piece, the length of the piece once that's revealed, the audio format once we know what that is, and the date when I'm ready to export. For now, we can leave that just as the headers and not fill in that additional information. In the next chapter of Lab 1, we'll get into the beginning of our second half, the edit itself.